The air over Babylon was thick with the stench of war, a miasma that clung to the city like a shroud. The sky, once a deep azure, was now choked with smoke, turning the sun into a distant, blood-red orb. The once mighty city, with its towering walls and majestic temples, stood defiant but beleaguered, its defenses strained by the relentless assault of the Persian Empire. At the heart of the city, in the shadow of the great ziggurat that reached for the heavens, General Nabonidus surveyed the scene with grim determination. His face, lined with the years of battle, was set in a mask of resolve. The city had withstood countless sieges in its long history, but this was different. The Persian Empire, led by the formidable Cyrus the Great, had brought a storm that even Babylon's legendary walls might not hold against. The city's defenses were formidable, built to withstand the onslaught of enemies from all corners of the world. The Euphrates River, which cut through the city, was both a lifeline and a barrier, its waters diverted into the city's canals, making it nearly impossible for invaders to cross. The walls themselves were towering and thick, designed to repel even the most determined assault. But the Persians had come prepared, and the siege engines that now loomed on the horizon were unlike anything Nabonidus had ever seen. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the city, Nabonidus turned to his gathered generals, their faces mirroring his own grim determination. The air was tense, the weight of the coming battle pressing down on them like a physical force. "We must hold the line," Nabonidus said, his voice low and steady. "Babylon has stood for 1,000 years, and it will stand for 1,000 more. These Persians may think they can break us, but they do not know the strength of our walls, nor the resolve of our people." One of his generals, Belshazzar, nodded, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "The men are ready, General. We have fortified the gates and doubled the watch on the walls. The river's currents are strong, and the canals will slow any advance. The Persians may be relentless, but they will find no easy victory here." Nabonidus allowed himself a small, grim smile. "Good. We will show them what it means to face the might of Babylon. Let them come. We will be ready." The Persian camp. On the outskirts of Babylon, the vast encampment of the Persian army stretched as far as the eye could see. Tents of rich, dark fabric were arranged in neat rows, the banners of Cyrus the Great fluttering in the hot wind. The air was thick with the smell of horses, sweat, and the iron tang of sharpened steel. Soldiers moved with purpose, their armor clinking as they prepared for the coming assault. Cyrus the Great stood at the center of the camp, his gaze fixed on the distant walls of Babylon. His face, weathered by years of conquest, was calm, his eyes betraying nothing of the thoughts that churned behind them. He was a man who had built an empire from the ashes of lesser kingdoms, and now his gaze was set on Babylon, the jewel of Mesopotamia. Beside him stood his most trusted generals, men who had fought by his side in countless battles, who had seen the rise of the Persian Empire and had been instrumental in its expansion. One of them, Harpagus, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a scar that ran the length of his face, stepped forward, his voice gruff but respectful. "Babylon's walls are formidable, my lord," Harpagus said, his eyes narrowing as he studied the city's defenses. "They have withstood countless sieges. But we have something they do not, our resolve and your leadership. With your command, we will breach those walls and bring Babylon to its knees." Cyrus nodded, his expression unreadable. "The Babylonians are proud, Harpagus, but pride can be a weakness. They rely on their walls, their river, their history. But history does not win battles, strategy does. We will use their pride against them." Another general, Gobryas, stepped forward, his voice measured and thoughtful. "The Euphrates is their lifeline, but it is also their weakness. If we can find a way to control the river, we can breach the walls from within. The canals that run through the city could be our key." Cyrus turned to Gobryas, his eyes narrowing with interest. "Explain." Gobryas nodded, his hand tracing the air as he outlined his plan. "The river's flow is controlled by a series of dams and gates. If we can divert the water, we could lower the river enough to allow our troops to enter the city through the riverbed. It would be a risky maneuver, but if successful, it would catch the Babylonians off guard." Harpagus nodded in agreement, his hand tightening on the hilt of his sword. It is a bold plan, but it could work. If we can breach the walls from within, Babylon's defenses will crumble. Cyrus considered the plan, his mind racing as he weighed the risks and rewards. Finally, he nodded, a slow, deliberate motion. It is a gamble, but one worth taking. We will prepare for the assault. Have the engineers begin work on the dams. And prepare the men, they must be ready to move as soon as the river is diverted. The generals nodded, their expressions determined. They knew that the battle for Babylon would be one of the most difficult they had ever faced, but they also knew that victory here would solidify the Persian Empire's dominance over the known world. Cyrus turned back to the city, his gaze hardening. Babylon will fall, he said, his voice low and resolute. And when it does, the world will know the strength of Persia. The battle begins. As night fell, a tense stillness settled over Babylon. The city's defenders stood watch on the walls, their eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. The torches that lined the battlements flickered in the wind, casting long shadows that danced like specters in the night. Below, in the streets of the city, the people of Babylon huddled in their homes, their hearts heavy with fear. They had heard the stories of Cyrus the Great, of his unstoppable army, and of the cities that had fallen before him. But they also knew the strength of their walls, the power of their gods, and the determination of their defenders. In the great hall of the palace, General Nabonidus stood before a map of the city, his generals gathered around him. The room was dimly lit, the flickering light of the oil lamps casting shadows across their faces. The Persians are patient, Nabonidus said, his voice a low rumble. They know they cannot breach our walls with brute force, so they will try to outthink us. We must be vigilant, watch for any sign of weakness in our defenses. They will look for any opportunity to exploit. Belshazzar, standing at Nabonidus' side, nodded. We have doubled the watch on the walls, General. The men are ready. But the river, it worries me. The Persians have engineers, skilled men who could try to manipulate the flow. Nabonidus' gaze darkened. The river is our strength, but it could also be our undoing if we are not careful. We must ensure that the gates and dams are secure. If the water levels drop, it could provide the Persians with the opening they need. Another general, Ashurnasir, stepped forward, his expression grim. We should prepare for the possibility of an attack from within. If the Persians find a way to enter the city, we must be ready to respond quickly. The people are frightened, but they will fight if they must. Nabonidus nodded, his mind racing as he considered the various scenarios. The tension in the room was palpable, a reflection of the fear that gripped the entire city. We must be ready for anything, he said, his voice firm. Babylon has stood for 1,000 years, and it will not fall easily. But we must be prepared to defend it with everything we have. As the night wore on, the tension in the city grew. The defenders on the walls kept their eyes fixed on the horizon, watching for any sign of movement from the Persian camp. The people of Babylon huddled together in their homes, praying to their gods for protection. And then, in the darkness before dawn, the attack came. The assault. The first sign of the Persian assault was a low rumble that echoed through the night, a sound that sent a shiver down the spines of the Babylonian defenders. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and then, suddenly, the Euphrates River began to recede. Panic spread through the ranks of the defenders as the water levels dropped, exposing the riverbed beneath the city's walls. The Persians had succeeded in diverting the river, lowering it enough to allow their troops to advance through the canals and into the heart of the city. Nabonidus, alerted by the sudden commotion, rushed to the walls, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked out over the city and saw the dark figures of Persian soldiers moving through the riverbed, their forms barely visible in the dim light of dawn. To arms! Nabonidus shouted, his voice ringing out across the walls. The Persians are in the city. Drive them back! The defenders sprang into action, their swords drawn, their shields raised. They rushed to the gates, where the Persians were beginning to emerge from the canals, their weapons gleaming in the early morning light. The battle that followed was fierce and chaotic. The Babylonians fought with a desperate intensity, their swords clashing with the steel of the Persian invaders. The streets of the city, once filled with the sounds of everyday life, were now a cacophony of battle cries, the clash of metal on metal, and the screams of the dying. Nabonidus fought at the front, his sword a blur as he cut down the advancing Persians. His generals, Belshazzar and Ashurnasir among them, fought by his side, their faces grim with determination. They knew that this battle would determine the fate of Babylon, and they would not let their city fall without a fight. But the Persians were relentless. Cyrus the Great had chosen his men well, and they fought with a discipline and ferocity that matched the Babylonians' desperation. Wave after wave of Persian soldiers poured into the city, overwhelming the defenders with their sheer numbers. In the midst of the chaos, Nabonidus caught sight of Cyrus himself, the Persian king leading his men into battle. Cyrus was a towering figure, his armor gleaming in the dawn light, his sword cutting through the Babylonian ranks with deadly precision. He fought with the confidence of a man who knew he would win, who had already seen the outcome of the battle in his mind. Nabonidus pushed through the throng of soldiers, his eyes locked on Cyrus. He knew that if he could strike down the Persian king, it might turn the tide of the battle. But as he closed the distance, he was intercepted by Harpagus, the scarred Persian general who had stood by Cyrus's side since the beginning of the siege. Harpagus was a formidable opponent, his movements swift and calculated. He blocked Nabonidus' strike with ease, countering with a blow that sent the Babylonian general stumbling back. They fought fiercely, their swords clashing in a dance of death, neither willing to give ground. But Harpagus was the better swordsman. With a quick, brutal strike, he disarmed Nabonidus, sending his sword clattering to the ground. Nabonidus stared at the Persian general, his breath coming in ragged gasps, knowing that his time was up. But before Harpagus could deliver the killing blow, a shout rang out from behind him. Belshazzar, seeing his general in danger, charged at Harpagus, his sword raised high. Harpagus turned just in time to block the strike, but the force of the blow sent him reeling. Nabonidus seized the opportunity, grabbing his fallen sword and lunging at Harpagus. The Persian general barely had time to react before Nabonidus' blade found its mark, slicing through his armor and plunging into his chest. Harpagus staggered back, his eyes wide with shock. Blood bubbled from his lips as he tried to speak, but no words came. With a final, rasping breath, he fell to the ground, his lifeless eyes staring up at the sky. Nabonidus wasted no time, turning to face Cyrus once more. But the Persian king was already surrounded by his men, his presence a rallying point for the invading soldiers. The Babylonians were being pushed back, their defenses crumbling under the relentless assault. Realizing that the battle was lost, Nabonidus called for a retreat. "Fall back," he shouted, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "Fall back to the inner city. We must regroup." The Babylonian defenders began to retreat, fighting desperately to hold the Persians at bay as they withdrew toward the heart of the city. The streets were choked with bodies, the ground slick with blood, and the air filled with the acrid stench of smoke and death. Nabonidus and his generals managed to reach the inner city, where they hastily regrouped with the remaining defenders. But the situation was dire. The Persians had breached the outer defenses, and it was only a matter of time before they broke through to the palace. As Nabonidus stood among his men, his sword still dripping with the blood of his enemies, he knew that Babylon was on the brink of falling. But he also knew that they could not give up. They had to fight to the last man, to defend their city, their home, with every ounce of strength they had left. The fall of Babylon. The final assault came as the sun began to set, casting a blood-red glow over the city. The Persians had regrouped and were now advancing on the inner walls, their siege engines rolling forward with deadly precision. Nabonidus stood at the front of the remaining defenders, his face streaked with sweat and blood. He could see the determination in the eyes of his men, but he could also see the exhaustion, the fear. They had fought valiantly, but they were outnumbered, outmatched. The walls that had protected Babylon for centuries were now crumbling before the might of the Persian Empire. Cyrus the Great led the final charge, his sword raised high as he urged his men forward. The Persians stormed the inner walls, their war cries echoing through the streets. The Babylonians fought back with everything they had, but it was not enough. The walls fell, and with them, the last hope of Babylon. As the Persians poured into the inner city, Nabonidus knew that the end was near. He fought on, his sword cutting down any who came near, but he could feel his strength fading. The weight of the battle, the loss of his city, pressed down on him like a crushing burden. The blade of vengeance. The steppe was a vast, desolate stretch of land, where the wind howled like the ghosts of the ancient dead and the sky seemed an endless expanse of gray. The grasses, once green and vibrant, now bent low under the weight of an approaching storm, their tips brushing the hooves of horses that galloped across the plain with a frantic urgency. The earth beneath them trembled with the force of their movement, as if the land itself quaked in fear of the violence that was about to unfold. Nabonidus, once the proud king of Babylon and the general of its defenses, now fled across this barren landscape, his mind a storm of despair and regret. He had watched as the walls of Babylon, the great city he had sworn to protect, crumbled before the might of the Persian Empire. The memories of the battle, the screams of his dying men, and the sight of the city burning haunted him as he rode, pushing his horse to its limits. His family, those few who had survived, clung to the hope that they might escape the Persian pursuit, but Nabonidus knew the truth. The Persian army was relentless, and there was no sanctuary to be found in the wilderness. As he glanced over his shoulder, Nabonidus saw the dark forms of the Persian cavalry closing in, their armor glinting dully in the fading light. His heart sank as he realized that they were almost upon him. The speed of the Persian advance left him no time to think, only to act. His grip tightened on the reins, and he urged his horse to go faster, though the animal was already exhausted. Nabonidus looked up to the sky, seeking solace from the gods, but the heavens were silent, indifferent to the suffering below. He knew that this might be the end, that his life, his reign, and the legacy of Babylon would be snuffed out in this remote corner of the world, far from the walls that had once protected him. And then, as despair began to take hold, Nabonidus caught sight of something in the distance, a figure, dark against the pale grasses, riding with a speed that defied belief. The figure was clad in black, atop a jet-black horse that seemed to blend with the shadows of the coming night. As the figure drew closer, Nabonidus could see the glint of a sword in the rider's hand, a sword that shone with a cold, unnatural light. The figure was not part of his fleeing company, nor was it one of the Persians. It was someone else, someone unknown, but fierce and determined. Nabonidus's breath caught in his throat as he realized that this lone rider was charging directly at the Persian flank, a solitary warrior against the might of the empire's forces. The rider reached the Persian cavalry with a roar that seemed to shake the very air. He swung his sword, a clumsy motion that should have been ineffective against the trained soldiers, but the result was nothing short of miraculous. The blade tore through the armored Persian soldiers as if they were made of paper, cleaving them in two with a single stroke. Blood sprayed across the grass, staining it a deep crimson, and the Persian advance faltered as they realized that something, or someone, had challenged their dominance. The fight for survival. The young man continued his assault, his black horse moving with a speed that defied reason, weaving through the ranks of the Persian soldiers with terrifying precision. Every time the rider swung his sword, another Persian soldier fell, their bodies crumpling to the ground as if the life had been drained from them in an instant. The young man's attacks were wild, unrefined, but they carried a force that was unlike anything Nabonidus had ever seen. Nabonidus watched in stunned silence, his hope for survival rekindled by the sight of this fierce warrior. But even as the young man fought, the Persians turned their attention to him, realizing that this lone rider was a threat that could not be ignored. They drew their bows, notching arrows and aiming for the young man's heart. A volley of arrows flew through the air, a dark cloud of death descending upon the rider. But the young man was quick. He raised his sword, and with an awkward, almost desperate motion, he managed to deflect many of the arrows. The sound of steel meeting wood and iron rang out, a harsh, discordant music in the midst of battle. Yet, despite his efforts, the young man could not block them all. Several arrows found their mark, piercing his flesh, and blood began to flow from his wounds, staining his dark clothes a deeper shade of red. Still, the young man did not falter. He continued to fight, his sword swinging with the same ferocity, cutting down the Persian soldiers who dared to come near him. But the wounds took their toll, and soon the young man began to stagger, his movements growing slower, more labored. The Persians pressed their advantage, surrounding him, slashing at him with their swords. The young man's black horse reared, its hooves striking the ground as if trying to fend off the attackers, but it was no use. Finally, with a cry that echoed across the plain, the young man fell, his body collapsing to the ground in a pool of blood. The Persians swarmed over him, trampling his fallen form beneath their horses' hooves, eager to crush the life from him. Nabonidus, still riding, felt his heart sink. His hope had been rekindled only to be dashed once more. The sight of the young man's body, broken and bloodied, lying in the dust of the steppe, filled him with a deep despair. He had seen many men die in battle, but there was something about this young man, something about the way he had fought, that made his death feel like a terrible loss. But then, just as Nabonidus thought all was lost, a sound reached his ears, a sound like the roar of a storm, growing louder and louder until it drowned out the noise of battle. He turned in his saddle, his eyes wide with disbelief, and saw smoke rising from the place where the young man had fallen. The smoke billowed upward, thick and dark, swirling around the Persian soldiers like a living thing. And from within the smoke came a scream of pain and fury, a sound that chilled Nabonidus to the bone. The Persian soldiers turned in confusion, their weapons still raised, as the smoke parted to reveal a figure standing in the midst of the chaos. It was the young man, the same young man who had fallen, who had been trampled by the Persian horses. But he was no longer lying broken in the dirt. He was standing, his wounds miraculously healed, his eyes burning with a fierce, otherworldly light. The arrows that had pierced his flesh were gone, the wounds closed as if they had never been there. His sword, once clumsy and unrefined, now moved with a speed and precision that defied reason, cutting through the Persian soldiers as if they were nothing. The young man let out another scream, and with it came a burst of power that sent the Persian soldiers reeling. Arrows that had been lodged in his body flew out in all directions, impaling the soldiers who stood too close. The ground beneath his feet seemed to shake, as if the earth itself was responding to his fury. Nabonidus watched in awe as the young man mounted his black horse once more, his movements smooth and fluid. The horse, too, seemed to have been transformed, its eyes glowing with the same fierce light as its riders. The horse charged forward, its hooves striking the ground with a force that sent shockwaves through the Persian ranks. The young man swung his sword with a newfound strength, each strike faster and more precise than the last. The Persian soldiers fell before him like wheat before a scythe, their bodies torn apart by the sheer force of his attacks. Blood flowed freely, soaking the ground, and the air was filled with the screams of the dying. Nabonidus could hardly believe what he was seeing. This young man, who had seemed so clumsy and unrefined at first, was now a force of nature, a whirlwind of death that tore through the Persian ranks with terrifying efficiency. In a matter of minutes, the young man had killed hundreds of Persian soldiers, their bodies littering the ground like broken dolls. The Persians, who had been so confident in their victory, now found themselves in the grip of terror. They tried to flee, to escape the fury of the young man and his black horse, but there was no escape. The young man pursued them with relentless determination, his sword cutting them down as they ran. Not a single Persian soldier was spared. The plains, once a sea of golden grass, were now a charnel house, the earth soaked with blood. The conversation. When the last of the Persian soldiers had fallen, Nabonidus slowly approached the young man, who was now standing alone in the midst of the carnage. The black horse stood beside him, its breath coming in short, sharp bursts, its eyes still glowing with that eerie light. The young man was covered in blood, his clothes torn and stained, but his eyes were calm, almost serene, as if the battle had been nothing more than a passing storm. Nabonidus dismounted, his legs trembling as he walked toward the young man. He had never seen such terrible strength, such raw power, and he was filled with a mixture of awe and fear. He stopped a few paces away, his eyes searching the young man's face for some sign of humanity, some hint of the person he had been before the battle. "What is your name?" Nabonidus asked, his voice trembling despite his efforts to remain steady. The words seemed to hang in the air between them, carrying with them the weight of everything Nabonidus had just witnessed. The young man turned his gaze toward Nabonidus, his eyes still burning with the remnants of the power that had consumed him. There was a brief silence, broken only by the distant rumble of thunder on the horizon and the soft, labored breathing of the black horse. The storm was coming, a fitting backdrop to the storm that had just passed through the battlefield. "My name is Ira," the young man replied, his voice calm but with an undercurrent of something ancient and potent, something that belied his youthful appearance. "I am a citizen of Babylon." Nabonidus stared at Ira, struggling to reconcile the image of this bloodied, seemingly supernatural warrior with the simple name and claim of citizenship. This was no ordinary man, no mere citizen. But Nabonidus could see the sincerity in Ira's eyes, the deep connection to Babylon that seemed to pulse through him as naturally as blood through veins. "A citizen of Babylon," Nabonidus repeated softly, as if testing the words on his tongue. "You fight with a strength I have never seen, not even among the greatest warriors of our city. What are you, Ira?" Ira was silent for a moment, as if considering the question himself. His eyes, though fierce, flickered with something like uncertainty, as if the events of the battle had awakened a part of him that was as much a mystery to him as it was to Nabonidus. "I am what Babylon made me," Ira finally said, his voice heavy with the weight of untold history. "I was forged in the flames of its fall, in the ice of its despair. I do not know what I am, only that I am here now, and I will not let our people fall to the Persians without a fight." Nabonidus felt a strange mixture of emotions stir within him, relief, hope, but also a profound unease. There was something about Ira that felt unnatural, almost otherworldly. The way he had risen from the dead, the way he had slaughtered the Persians with such ruthless efficiency, it was as though he were more force than man. But Nabonidus was in no position to question a miracle, especially when that miracle had saved him from certain death. "The fortress has fallen," Nabonidus said, his voice heavy with sorrow. "Our city burns, and our people are scattered. I don't know how many of our forces remain, or if there is any hope of rallying them. We are outnumbered, outmaneuvered. The Persians will not stop until Babylon is no more." Ira's expression hardened at the mention of Babylon's fall, a flicker of anger flashing in his eyes. "Then we must strike back, while they are still reeling from this defeat," he said firmly. "Gather what remains of our army. We will not give them the chance to regroup. We will attack them, hit them where they least expect it. This is not over, Nabonidus. Not if we fight." Nabonidus was taken aback by Ira's proposal. The young man spoke with a conviction that seemed out of place for someone so young, yet there was a fire in his words that was impossible to ignore. "You speak of leading an army, Ira, but we have no army to lead. Most of our men are dead or have fled. Even if we could muster a force, what chance do we have against the might of Persia? Cyrus is not a man to be trifled with." Ira stepped closer, the blood on his face and hands making him look like a figure out of a nightmare. But his eyes, those burning, determined eyes, held Nabonidus's gaze with a force that was almost hypnotic. "We have the element of surprise," Ira said. "The Persians believe us broken, scattered. They will not expect a counterattack, especially not from someone like me." Nabonidus searched Ira's face, looking for any sign of hesitation, any hint that this was a fool's errand. But all he saw was resolve, an unbreakable will to fight, to protect what little remained of Babylon. And in that moment, Nabonidus made his decision. "Very well," Nabonidus said, his voice firming with resolve. "We will gather what men we can find. We will strike back at the Persians, and we will make them pay for what they have done to our city. If there is a chance, no matter how slim, we must take it." Ira nodded, a fierce determination lighting up his face. "We will move quickly," he said. "There is no time to lose. The Persians will not expect us to fight back, but we will show them the spirit of Babylon." The gathering of forces. As night fell over the steppe, Nabonidus and Ira moved with a purpose, their figures shadows in the dimming light. They rode through the scattered remnants of the Babylonian forces, seeking out any who had survived the battle and had not yet fled into the wilderness. It was a difficult task. Most of the men were demoralized, their spirits broken by the fall of their great city. But Ira spoke to them with a fire in his voice that rekindled the embers of their courage. "The fight is not over," Ira told them, his voice carrying over the wind. "Babylon has fallen, but we are still here. We are the last defenders of our city, the last hope for our people. Will you flee into the darkness and let the Persians take everything, or will you stand with me and fight?" The men listened, their eyes drawn to the bloodied figure before them, the sword in his hand still stained with the blood of the Persians. There was something about Ira that drew them in, something that made them believe, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Slowly, one by one, the men began to gather around him, their resolve hardening with each passing moment. Nabonidus watched in awe as Ira rallied the soldiers. He had seen great leaders in his time, men who could inspire their troops with a word or a gesture, but Ira was something different. There was a rawness to him, a power that came not just from his words, but from his very presence. It was as if the force of his will alone was enough to bend the world to his purpose. By the time the moon rose high in the sky, they had gathered a small force, a ragtag group of survivors, but men who were willing to fight to the death for their city. There were no formal ranks, no organized command structure, only a shared determination to strike back at the Persians who had taken everything from them. Ira stood before them, his sword raised high, the light of the moon glinting off the blade. "We move now," he said, his voice carrying over the assembled men. "The Persians think they have won, but they are wrong. We will strike them where they are weakest, where they least expect it. And we will show them that Babylon is not dead." The men cheered, a low, rumbling sound that grew in intensity until it echoed across the steppe. They were ready, and Ira knew that they would follow him into the heart of the storm. The Battle of Vengeance. The night was thick with the promise of violence as Ira led the Babylonian forces toward the Persian encampment. They moved like shadows across the steppe, the only sound the soft thud of hooves on the earth and the whisper of steel being drawn from its sheath. The air was heavy with anticipation, the kind that presses down on the chest and makes each breath feel like a weight. As they neared the encampment, Ira signaled for the men to halt. They crouched low in the tall grass, their eyes fixed on the rows of tents and the glow of campfires in the distance. The Persians were resting, confident in their victory, unaware of the storm that was about to descend upon them. Ira turned to Nabonidus, who crouched beside him, his expression tense but resolute. "We attack from the flanks," Ira whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. "They won't see it coming. Once we break through their lines, we push forward with everything we have. No mercy." Nabonidus nodded, his hand tightening on the hilt of his sword. "I trust your judgment, Ira. Let us, and we will follow." Ira gave a short nod, his eyes fixed on the camp ahead. He could feel the cold fire burning within him, the power that had surged through him in the earlier battle now simmering just beneath the surface. It was a power he did not fully understand, but one that he knew would be unleashed when the time was right. He raised his sword, the blade catching the light of the moon as it cut through the air. The men behind him tensed, their muscles coiled like springs, ready to launch into the fray. And then, with a cry that split the night, Ira charged forward, his black horse surging ahead like a bolt of lightning. The Babylonian forces followed, their voices rising in a fierce battle cry that echoed across the plains. The Persian camp erupted into chaos as the Babylonian soldiers descended upon them. Ira was at the forefront, his sword a blur as it cut through the Persian ranks with a terrifying precision. The soldiers, caught off guard, scrambled to defend themselves, but they were no match for the fury of the Babylonian assault. The cold flame of vengeance. The moon hung low in the sky, its light a pale, silvery glow that cast long shadows across the steppe. The Persian encampment, once a sea of tents and flickering campfires, now lay in disarray, a landscape of chaos and bloodshed. The night air, already chilled by the autumn wind, grew colder still as Ira advanced into the heart of the enemy's camp, his sword gleaming with an unnatural frost. The Persian soldiers, who had been roused from sleep by the sudden onslaught, found themselves facing an enemy that defied explanation. Ira moved among them like a phantom, his jet-black horse a blur of shadow and speed. The sword in his hand emanated a cold that seemed to seep into the very marrow of the men who dared to face him. It was a cold not of this world, a chill that cut deeper than any blade, freezing the blood in their veins, turning their breath to mist even as their lifeblood spilled onto the frozen earth. Ira's movements were a dance of death, each swing of his sword slicing through armor, flesh, and bone with a precision that belied the seeming clumsiness of his strikes. The Persian soldiers fell before him, their cries of pain cut short by the cold that consumed them. It was as if the sword itself hungered for their lives, feeding on their fear, drawing strength from their terror. The coldness that emanated from Ira's blade was not just a physical sensation, it was a palpable force, a darkness that chilled the very soul. The Persian army, though vast and well-trained, faltered in the face of this unexpected assault. They were 100 times larger than the small force that Ira led, but numbers meant nothing against the force that Ira had become. The cold spread through the camp like a plague, sapping the strength of the soldiers, turning their weapons into useless lumps of ice, their limbs stiff and unresponsive. The very air around Ira seemed to crackle with frost, the ground beneath his horse's hooves freezing solid as he rode. Cyrus the Great, the formidable leader of the Persian Empire, stood at the edge of the battle, his eyes narrowing as he watched the carnage unfold. He had faced many foes in his time, conquered many lands, but never had he seen anything like this. The man before him, this Ira, was not just a warrior, he was something else entirely, something beyond the understanding of mortal men. There was a power in him, a cold fire that defied the natural order, that turned the very forces of life and death against those who opposed him. Cyrus's generals, men who had fought by his side in countless battles, now looked to him for guidance, their expressions a mix of fear and uncertainty. Mazars, the scarred general who had survived so many campaigns, shook his head in disbelief. "This is no ordinary foe, my lord," he said, his voice tinged with something approaching dread. "He fights with a power that I cannot explain. It is as if winter itself fights at his side." Cyrus nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving Ira as he cut through his soldiers like a reaper in the fields. "He is more than a man," Cyrus said, his voice low, measured. "But even so, he can be defeated. We must not lose our resolve." But as the battle raged on, it became clear that resolve alone would not be enough. The Persian soldiers, despite their numbers and their training, were falling one by one, their bodies littering the ground. The cold that Ira brought with him was relentless, merciless, freezing the blood in their veins, turning their breath to mist. It was a cold that could not be fought, could not be reasoned with, a cold that consumed all in its path. The icy heart of the storm. As Ira rode deeper into the Persian ranks, the cold around him intensified. The sword seemed to pulse with a life of its own, each swing releasing a wave of frost that swept through the enemy like a deadly tide. The sword's blade was a thing of terrible beauty, its edge gleaming with an icy blue light that reflected the fear in the eyes of those who dared to meet it. The frost that clung to the blade grew thicker with each strike, until it seemed as if the sword itself was made of pure, unyielding ice. The Persian soldiers who faced Ira found themselves gripped by a terror unlike anything they had ever known. The cold that emanated from the sword was not just physical, it was a chill that reached deep into their hearts, freezing their courage, turning their resolve to brittle shards. They could feel the life draining from them, their strength sapped by the relentless cold, their very souls shivering as they faced the dark figure on the black horse. Ira's face was set in a mask of determination, his eyes burning with a fierce, unearthly light. The power that flowed through him was both exhilarating and terrifying, a force that he could barely control, but that drove him forward with a single-minded purpose. He was no longer just a man, he was the embodiment of Babylon's vengeance, a weapon forged in the fires of its destruction, tempered by the cold of its despair. The battle raged around him, but Ira was aware of only one thing, the need to drive the Persians from Babylon, to make them pay for the suffering they had inflicted on his people. The cold that flowed from his sword was a reflection of the cold fury that burned within him, a fury that had been kindled the moment he had seen his city fall, his people scattered. But the power that Ira wielded was not without its price. With each swing of his sword, with each wave of frost that swept through the Persian ranks, Ira could feel the toll it took on his body. The cold that radiated from sword seeped into his very bones, chilling him from the inside out. His breath came in ragged gasps, each exhalation a plume of mist that hung in the air like a ghost. The power that had saved him from death was also slowly consuming him, freezing him from within even as it destroyed his enemies. Yet Ira fought on, driven by a force greater than himself. The pain, the cold, the exhaustion, all of it was secondary to the need to protect what remained of Babylon. He could not, would not, stop until the Persian army was broken, until the city was safe once more. The turning of the tide. Cyrus the Great watched in grim silence as his army was decimated by the relentless assault. His generals, once confident in their victory, now stood in shocked disbelief as they witnessed the devastation wrought by a single man. The cold that emanated from Ira's sword had spread through the camp like a disease, turning the ground to ice, freezing the bodies of the fallen in grotesque, twisted shapes. Mazars, ever the strategist, approached Cyrus, his expression one of deep concern. "My lord," he said, his voice low, urgent. "We must consider a retreat. This battle, we cannot win it. Not against him." Cyrus turned to Mazars, his eyes narrowing. The thought of retreat was anathema to him, a stain on his honor as a conqueror. But as he looked out over the battlefield, at the shattered remains of his once mighty army, he knew that Mazars was right. The Persian Empire had never faced an enemy like this before, and to continue the fight would be to throw away the lives of his men needlessly. "Order the retreat," Cyrus said, his voice tight with the effort of the decision. "We will fall back and regroup. Babylon is not worth the annihilation of our forces." Mazars nodded, though there was no triumph in his eyes, only the grim satisfaction of a decision made for survival rather than glory. He turned and began barking orders to the remaining officers, who quickly relayed the command to their troops. The Persian soldiers, already demoralized and broken by the cold, began to withdraw, their movements sluggish and uncoordinated as they tried to escape the battlefield. But Ira was not finished. Seeing the Persians beginning to retreat, Ira spurred his black horse forward, cutting through the fleeing soldiers with a renewed fury. The sword flashed in the dim light, each strike accompanied by a burst of frost that left the ground behind him a frozen wasteland. He pursued the Persians with a relentless determination, cutting them down as they ran, showing no mercy to those who had invaded his homeland. The retreat quickly turned into a rout as the Persian soldiers, once disciplined and unyielding, fled in terror from the force that Ira had become. The cold was everywhere, clinging to their skin, freezing their breath in their throats. They could feel the life being drained from them, their strength sapped by the icy wind that followed Ira wherever he went. Cyrus watched in disbelief as his army disintegrated before his eyes. The retreat had turned into a disaster, his soldiers falling like leaves in a winter storm. He knew that to stay any longer would be to risk his own life, and with a heavy heart, he turned his horse away from the battlefield, leading the remnants of his forces away from Babylon. The victory of Frost. As the last of the Persian soldiers fled into the night, the battlefield fell silent. The air was thick with the scent of blood and the bitter cold of Ira's power. The ground was littered with the bodies of the fallen, frozen in their final moments of terror, their eyes wide and unseeing. The fires that had once burned brightly in the Persian camp were now smoldering embers, their light swallowed by the encroaching frost. Ira stood at the center of it all, his breath coming in ragged gasps, the sword still clenched in his hand. The power that had driven him through the battle was now ebbing, leaving behind a deep, bone-chilling cold that seeped into every part of his being. His vision blurred, his strength fading as the exhaustion of the fight finally caught up with him. Nabonidus, who had watched the final stages of the battle from a distance, now approached Ira, his steps cautious as he took in the devastation around him. The cold that lingered in the air made every breath a struggle, and he could feel the frost biting at his skin as he neared the young warrior. "Ira," Nabonidus began, his voice trembling with a mix of awe and fear. You have done what no other could. You have driven the Persians from our land. You have saved Babylon." Ira looked up, his eyes dull with exhaustion. The fire that had burned so brightly in them during the battle was now dim, replaced by a weariness that seemed to seep into his very soul. "It is not over," he said quietly, his voice barely more than a whisper. "The Persians will return. They always return." Nabonidus nodded, though the truth of Ira's words weighed heavily on his heart. "Then we will be ready," he said, placing a hand on Ira's shoulder. "With you to lead us, Babylon will stand strong against any who would seek to destroy it." Ira shook his head slowly, the weight of the sword in his hand now too much to bear. He let it drop to the ground, the blade sinking into the frozen earth with a dull thud. "I am no leader," he said, his voice filled with a sadness that seemed to come from some deep, hidden place within him. "I am a weapon, nothing more. A weapon forged in the fires of war and tempered by the cold of death." Nabonidus frowned, his grip tightening on Ira's shoulder. "You are more than that, Ira. You are a symbol of hope, a beacon of strength for our people. They will look to you now, as I do, to guide us through the darkness that still threatens our city." Ira's gaze drifted to the horizon, where the first light of dawn was beginning to break through the clouds. The night was over, but the cold remained, a reminder of the power he had unleashed and the cost it had exacted. He could feel the frost still clinging to him, a chill that would not leave, a cold that had become a part of him. "I will lead, if that is what is needed," Ira finally said, his voice heavy with resignation. "But do not expect warmth from me, Nabonidus. I am what I am, fire and ice, life and death. I can offer you victory, but not mercy." Nabonidus nodded slowly, understanding the burden that Ira carried. "That is enough," he said. "For now, that is enough." The aftermath. The victory over the Persians was celebrated throughout Babylon, though the city that had once been a beacon of civilization now lay in ruins. The people, weary from the constant threat of invasion, looked to Ira as their new leader, their protector. His victory had been nothing short of miraculous, and they hailed him as a hero, a savior sent by the gods to defend their city. But Ira did not feel like a hero. He moved through the streets of Babylon, his presence a cold shadow that fell over the celebrations. The people who cheered his name did not see the toll the battle had taken on him, the frost that clung to his soul, the emptiness that gnawed at him from within. He had become something more than human, but in doing so, he had lost a part of himself that he could never reclaim. Nabonidus, true to his word, appointed Ira as the general of Babylon's defenses, placing him in charge of rebuilding the city's fortifications and preparing for the inevitable return of the Persian forces. Ira accepted the role without complaint, throwing himself into the task with a single-minded determination that left little room for anything else. Under Ira's command, the walls of Babylon were rebuilt, stronger and taller than before. The defenses were reinforced, the soldiers trained to fight with the same cold precision that Ira had displayed on the battlefield. The people of Babylon, though still reeling from the destruction of their city, began to feel a renewed sense of hope, a belief that they could withstand whatever trials lay ahead. But even as he led them, Ira remained distant, a figure of ice and shadow. The power that had saved him, that had given him the strength to drive the Persians from Babylon, now felt like a curse, a cold fire that burned within him, consuming all that he once was. He could feel the frost spreading, creeping into the corners of his mind, freezing the memories of his past, the warmth of his humanity. And so, Ira became a symbol of Babylon's defiance, of its resilience in the face of annihilation. But he was also a symbol of something darker, a reminder of the cost of victory, the coldness that lay at the heart of power. The Persians had been driven back, but the battle was far from over. Cyrus the Great would return, and when he did, he would come with a vengeance. Ira knew this, and he prepared for it, the cold fire within him burning ever brighter, ever colder. The city looked to him for salvation, and he would give it to them, no matter the cost. But in the depths of his soul, Ira wondered if there would be anything left of him when the final battle was over, if the cold that had saved him would eventually consume him entirely, leaving behind nothing but ice and shadow. For now, though, Ira stood at the walls of Babylon, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon, where the dark clouds of the next storm were already gathering. And as the wind howled through the city, carrying with it the chill of the coming winter, Ira knew that his fight was far from over. Babylon had been saved, but the cost had yet to be fully paid.